So the last thing I want to talk about for this unit is going to be management strategies to help manage or reduce our parasite load or exposure for our horses. And this is really, really important because as you see, resistance to these dewormers is increasing. And as a result, there's going to come a time when dewormers are just no longer effective for controlling parasites if companies aren't going to find new dewormers and anthelmintics to be using for our horses. So we need to start looking at alternative solutions and other ways to create this well-rounded management picture to help keep our horses healthy. Because right now we are able to minimize the risk of parasitic disease, but there's going to come a time when we can't control it and it's going to be dangerous for the health of our horses. And I'm honestly pretty scared about it. And so what we want to see is, two main management systems I'm going to focus on are going to be my pasture and manure management. So let's begin with pasture management. So for my pasture management, this is going to be one of those areas that's important because think of our horses. They get these parasites from grazing, the majority of them. And so I want to manage the environment that they're grazing and can access these parasites. And so one thing that's going to be important is going to be the stocking rate. And so the ideal stocking rate is going to depend on how productive your pastures are, what the season is, how quickly they're regrowing, how carefully it's managed. But we kind of ballpark this around 2 acres per horse. Should be enough for the horse to consume adequate forage to meet their requirements and kind of have continuous access to forage. Once again, if you're not managing your pastures properly, you might need more than this. Or if you're really good at managing them, maybe you need a little less. But some reasons this is important is it is going to prevent overgrazing. So when you think of it, as horses graze, we have these areas called like roughs and lawns. So we have these areas where there's a lot of grass, and then we have these areas that are overgrazed. And when horses are given, and maybe not overgrazed, but grazed down closer to the ground, when horses have adequate pasture access, they have the ability to choose where they're grazing. And we tend to find that horses do not like to consume grass in areas where they're pooping. So they have these areas of defecation that they avoid and then areas that they choose to eat. I'm fortunate that I am able to manage my pastures effectively where my horses just don't need to eat everywhere. They eat where they want, and then I mow it down, let it regrow, and then they can, again, be selective about where they're eating. In comparison, when I moved in here, the pastures were extremely overgrazed. The horses just had continuous access to the whole area, and everything was eaten down to the ground because they were hungry. There was not enough grass, so they were going to eat whatever was available to them. So by preventing overgrazing, I can allow my horses to be selective and avoid the areas that they defecate because manure is where the parasites are going to be traveling through. And so the eggs, the larvae, they're tiny, right? They can only travel so far. So if I'm helping keep the horses away from those areas, that's going to be very beneficial. Another thing that my stocking rate does is reduces pasture contamination. So again, having a good stocking rate, it's not like I have, 10 horses on 2 acres where there's just going to be poop everywhere. Like you can avoid it. So those are going to be the 2 things that your stocking rate's going to help with. Another thing you can do is group horses by age, and that's primarily involving your younger horses, right? Our older horses tend to have more risks of small strongels. Our younger horses tend to have a greater risk of ascarids. And so trying to keep those groups separate so I'm not increasing the different parasites they're exposed to. Another thing is multiple species rotation. So back to the beginning of the unit when I mentioned that parasites are primarily species specific. And so if you were to put your horses out on pasture and then put goats or sheep out on the same pasture. One, they tend to maybe not be as picky. They might eat closer to the areas the horses have pooped. In doing so, they might consume those parasites, but the parasites can't complete their life cycle in the goats or sheep or cows, and so they'll just die. So it can be a way, and it's kind of mutually beneficial, right? Because the horses will do the same. Maybe they consume sheep and goat parasites that pass through them and die as well. So, I've been using this to try to slowly convince my husband to let me get sheep. And I've not won yet, but it is a slow burn. I'm working on it. Another thing I want to note is dragging with a ton of asterisks by it. We used to recommend this all the time. We said hot and dry weather, you can drag because parasites, they can survive cold pretty well, but hot and dry, they can't. Down in Missouri, you might be a little bit better than where we're at up in Minnesota, Wisconsin. But so climate will matter, but it's believed that kind of this upper Midwest, it's not hot or dry enough for long enough to actually kill the larva because they can withstand hot and dry for a bit. It just, if it's too long, now they might die. So for us, when we might have like a couple days or a week where it's in the 90s or 100s, it's probably not enough to kill them. And now all we're doing is just spreading the parasites around the pasture. So now the horses can't selectively graze. So it's a little tricky there. Versus when I was in Missouri and we had a heat advisory for over 2 months, maybe that was probably long enough that dragging could have been an effective practice. So I tend to lean towards not dragging up in the upper Midwest, but in a hotter, drier climate, it might be an effective management system. The other main management practice is going to be manure management. And so you think pasture is where the horses tend to have access to the parasites, which are traveling through the manure. So these two things make a lot of sense. For manure, I want to remove it 1 to 2 times a week. And you think of the life cycle, most of it is, 5 to 7 days is when the eggs develop into larvae and can reach that infective stage in warm climates. So if I'm picking the manure up where the eggs are and breaking up that life cycle, that's a good way to reduce the amount of parasites that are present on the pasture. And so I'll just make a note. Most larvae take 1 to 2 weeks to become infective. Okay, so these are the main components of parasite control. I think to some extent, this isn't even in my notes, but we'll just kind of add it, is, I don't even know how to say it, not quite a quarantine, but introduction of new horses. Making sure, so along with horses having to have a health certificate, a Coggins, vaccines up to date, I think it's important that they're also dewormed. And I wouldn't necessarily deworm them and toss them out right away. I'd give them that week or two to be expelling those parasites before they go out with the rest of the herd. But trying to reduce that exposure to any new parasites can be beneficial. Reducing your horses having interactions with other horses' manure when you're traveling places. Just paying attention to that is going to be similar to, trying to prevent them from getting sick or having illnesses. But I just say kind of giving them a choice, kind of reducing their access to that manure as they're consuming hay, pasture, their feed is going to be important. But I had horses when they were in a poorly managed facility, they were high shedders. And normally a horse will stay in the same category throughout most of their life. However, I brought them home and I was removing manure 1 to 2 times a week. I had a solid pasture management system. They had adequate pasture access, and they all went down to 0 eggs per gram. And so, managing it is capable of, or managing their environment is capable of helping manage their parasites if you are willing to put the time in and have access to the facilities to do it properly.